Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. And today I want to talk about video game sequels. I've been thinking a lot about sequels lately. I did a video on Breath of the Wild last week and a video of Tears of the Kingdom this week. I wanted to talk about what makes a fantastic video game sequel and when they do something so great that it eclipses the original, and other sequels that just don't quite hit the mark or don't live up to the original and what the difference is. I think the primary reason a lot of sequels don't ultimately end up being better than the original is because of innovation versus iteration. I feel like a lot of sequels tend to play it safe because the original succeeded so well. They want to iterate a little more than innovate, so that way they make sure that they capture the same audience. And I think that's a very good plan. I think a lot of games really benefit from that. If you look at Tears of the Kingdom, there is some innovation there. I don't want to say that it's not innovative. You have a much more expanded map. You have brand new mechanics, like a robust building system. There's a lot to see in Tears of the Kingdom that you can say, yeah, they definitely innovated from Breath of the Wild. But if you look at the two games on a whole and some of the comments I've heard and other things on the internet, Tears of the Kingdom does feel like just an extension of Breath of the Wild. It feels like a lot of the same despite doing different things. The abilities are different, but it still feels like a very similar adventure in a lot of ways. And if you're looking for something brand new that's going to shake your world, I don't think Tears of the Kingdom is too dissimilar from Breath of the Wild that people are going to be absolutely mind blown. I think the biggest distinction is if you really love the building mechanic and that's something that's super important to you, you might sink a ton of time into this game just building all sorts of fantastic things, and then it becomes a much better game for you. For me, and I would assume a lot of people, the adventure was the primary thing and the building mechanic was completely secondary. For me, I just did not enjoy the building nearly as much, and I liked that I didn't have to enjoy the building. I could just build when I needed to and not worry about it otherwise. So for me, Breath of the Wild is the superior game in terms of the quality between the two, just because it was so innovative at the time. It did so much new and fresh for the series. It was a spectacle to see, and Tears of the Kingdom felt more of the same. Another sequel that I felt the exact same way about was God of War Ragnarok. This was a 10 out of 10 experience for me. I had a great time. I felt it capped off the Norse duology incredibly well. A really emotional story that I really cared about. But was it better than the original? I didn't think so. Despite all these beautiful story elements, some great boss fights, the gameplay was tightened up a little bit. I felt so much less awe and wonder from Ragnarok than I did when I first experienced God of War 2018. And I think that is one of the biggest pitfalls that sequels fall into. It's just, we're going to iterate more than innovate, and we're not going to capture magic like we did before. And I think, again, I think that's a fine reasoning to have, because it is hard to constantly be innovating. But if you look at some other sequels that have done such a good job at innovating despite being a direct sequel, despite being on the same console, they do so much more with the material and do such a better job that it becomes such a beautiful experience that ultimately eclipses the original. This might be a controversial one, but I feel like Majora's Mask does that over Ocarina of Time. The two both exist on the Nintendo 64. They're put out within a few years of each other. Ocarina of Time is heralded as one of the best video games of all time. But for me, and I've seen lots of people have this opinion, Majora's Mask is the superior experience because they do something brand new, especially with the theming. The theming in Majora's Mask is so dark and scary, and it's something that the Zelda series really hadn't dabbled in at that point, and they did completely different things with the gameplay mechanics. Despite the visuals looking very similar, despite this being clearly in the same engine, designed for the same console, the games feel very distinct from each other. You're utilizing masks in Majora's Mask to change into different beings. You're changing between a Deku Scrub, Link, Goron, and a Zora, and it's a beautiful experience. You have other masks that change the gameplay in different ways. I just love all the things that they did with that game, between the mask system and how combat works, playing as the different races that you get to experience, versus combined with the theming as well, make that a really tight and fantastic experience that I enjoy more than going back to play Ocarina of Time. I just have more fond memories of Majora's Mask because I think they did something unique and beautiful with that game despite them being on the same console. Same thing if you look at Uncharted 2. Uncharted 1 is a good game. It's very fun. I played that one first, and I think that's exactly how you should play the Uncharted series because it is very dated. The controls aren't nearly as tight as the later entries in the series. But Uncharted 2 did something even better with the series. Now I will say that this one is one of the rare cases where I feel like it did innovate a lot, or iterated a lot. It didn't do a ton of innovation, but the things it did innovate on paid off in spades. It has bigger set pieces. It's a little more bombastic. They improved the controls in a major way, and it feels much more like a big giant action movie that you're experiencing, but more than the original did. The original did it very well. I think they had a great proof of concept, but Uncharted 2 took that to much greater lengths and gave you this beautiful cinematic experience with great stakes and everything that really pulls you into the Uncharted universe and made Uncharted a household name for Sony. Another sequel, though, that I want to look at that doesn't do quite as much for me is The Last of Us Part 2. I love both The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. Do not get me wrong. The Last of Us is my third favorite video game of all time, and I think Part 2 continues the story in a major way. And the fact that they shook it up so much by giving you a completely different character to play as for pretty much half of the game and experiencing these two different stories and how they collide, how they intersect with each other, I think is a beautiful idea. But for me, again, the emotional impact of the first game and everything that the story told hit so much harder than the second one did, despite the heavy themes, despite the really visceral nature of killing people in Uncharted and The Last of Us 2, and how awful it is and how awful it feels to play through that game. They did a lot to kind of try and bring the series moving forward and make it this raw emotional experience, but it didn't top the original for me because the original did something so unique and so special that's just really hard to look at Part 2 and say that that's a better experience on the whole. That's putting the controversy aside. I actually have no problem with The Last of Us Part 2 in terms of what it did. I'm actually going to make a video on that very soon because I really want to talk about that game and why I think it's so fantastic. But for me, video game sequels just a lot of times play it a little too safe for me, or just do a little more of the same. And if you're looking for that, it's great. And I feel like a lot of people are looking for that. We see that in society constantly in terms of media. We have sequels to everything. Movies get sequels, TV series get sideshows because we know the established property works. We know the formula works. So they're like, let's just expand on that, give some little tweaks and twists here and there, and we'll ship it out and people will love it. And for the most part, they're right. And for me, I am the exact same way. A lot of sequels, I am really happy and content to just play more of the same. But it does not feel as compelling or drive me forward to actually complete the game in a lot of instances. I mentioned before God of War Ragnarok and Tears of the Kingdom. Two games that I absolutely adored, had a 10 out of 10 experience with, but I had a little bit harder time getting through the game. It wasn't quite as compelling to me, despite loving the property and despite loving the previous game. It's just when you have more of the same, it is more difficult to really feel captivated by it. And I feel like video game developers have a really hard time with this because innovating and creating new IPs and doing new mechanics is a really hard thing. It's really difficult to do that. But when they do something brand new and unique, it just really is a great testament to their ability to take a risk and capitalize on it. Majora's Mask was probably a big risk for, I don't know if it's a big risk for Nintendo. They're huge. Nintendo 64 was doing pretty well, and they weren't doing as well as their contemporaries, but they were doing pretty well. But Ocarina of Time being so well received and then doing something drastically different with Majora's Mask probably was a risk in itself. But the fact that it paid off so well and that it's so beloved now, and it got like a 3DS port later on, it's developed a cult following, it's just really cool to see when a studio will take the time to do something riskier with a direct sequel and watch it pay off. So that's my thoughts on sequels. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.